I have a question from a Patreon supporter. I can give the link below this video. You can join me on Patreon, ask me questions, and they're going to result in videos just like this one. So normally I'm clean-shaven and I'm recording at home, not covered in stuff while recording in a hotel room. But anyway, that's my girl Melissa. She can chime in anytime, but she's kind of more off-camera than on-camera with this video. Spontaneously recording in a hotel room. So I got an interesting question from a Patreon supporter in response to a critique of Islam more than a month ago on this channel. But I want to emphasize, this question has a direct bearing on my critique of communism, on political discussions of and criticism of almost any conceivable political position, but including important political questions within veganism, animal rights, ecology, etc. Right? Now, this is an interesting case where I took notes on the question and then came back and looked at the original wording. I felt that this question boiled down to challenging me by asking, does any particular example in politics really count? How can you treat an example as representative? And left-wingers and communists do this very often. Just yesterday, we heard Mexi and Privileged Vegan playing exactly this game where they want to pretend that the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin doesn't count. Like, it's only a particular example of communism. It doesn't count in representing communism as a whole. And the particular dictatorship in China under Mao Zedong doesn't count. And you can see where this is going. Now, I think a few people are immature enough that their problem really is a failure to apprehend the relationship between the ideal and the real. But most of the time what you're dealing with is a completely cynical, intentional misrepresentation of things to justify a particular ideological or political position. I don't think it's the case that Mexi and a Privileged Vegan really fail to understand the gravity of the deaths of millions of people due to government-engineered starvation in China under Mao Zedong, something I have videos on. You can click through the playlist. Maybe I'll give you a link, maybe I won't. But I do actually have some detailed videos talking about those issues on this channel, put up about 2 years ago, I think. I have done research on it, I do know details. Or, policies, even something that doesn't have such a big body count attached to it, policies about freedom of speech that resulted in people being hunted down and killed for daring to criticize the government, that resulted in people being put in prison for what we would think of today as not just trivial complaints against the government, but sometimes just pleas for help, just reporting that people were starving in their own village and that they needed the government's help. And that being responded to with terrible repression due to a lack of freedom of speech. And that doesn't add up to millions of deaths, but of course has a horrible chilling effect on society. We were just listening to two self-identified revolutionary socialists or communists making excuses along these lines and saying, well, you can't treat these examples as definitive. And I think a more accurate way to phrase that is you can't treat this example as representing anything other than itself. And if we phrase it that way, of course, that is absolutely true. So, for example, political corruption in Florida, in the United States, that resulted in the election of George W. Bush, the first election of George W. Bush. That is a problem. That is a case study. That's something we can study in political science, and it would never really occur to anyone to raise this kind of ghastly specter of dismissing the significance of the role of corruption and incompetence in that election and how the actual ballots were counted and many other things. But including just the counting of ballots itself was one of the problems in that election. Okay, so this was a corrupt election, this was a flawed election, this was an illegitimate election. Why would anyone construe that as either representing or failing to represent an ideal of democracy? I mean, it doesn't even occur to us to say, no, you can't look at this example as impugning the ideal of what democracy ought to be. Because we already know, it's a familiar enough thing in our culture or in this political context, that we're not discussing what democracy ought to be. We're discussing what democracy is. We're discussing how democracy in the United States of America around the year 2000 in Florida actually operates. We're engaged in discussion of the real, not of the ideal. Yeah. Now, in matters of religion, in matters of ideology, including vegan ideology, ecology, animal rights, etc., or Islam, naturally, people drift away from discussing the real as real, and they do get caught up in this type of problem of demanding to know, how dare you treat this example as representing something other than itself? How dare you treat this example as if it represented an ideal? And my answer is, in effect, every time, no, this example truly matters. It's genuinely important in and of itself without representing anything outside of itself, anything larger or anything smaller than itself. So if you look at, for example, the history of democracy in Haiti, let's say the whole history of politics in Haiti, the history of Haiti is something tremendously important in itself. And I think it would be laughable and absurd if someone claimed that the history of Haiti represents the history of all black people, like black people in the United States of America or black people in Brazil. You'd say, no, what are you talking about? This is Haiti. This is the political history of Haiti. Now, of course, there were some connections, there were some parallels, there were some contrasts, but even if you want to compare the history of Haiti to the history of Cuba, Cuba is right next door, no, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to generalize racially. It doesn't make sense to generalize geographically. Either the history of Haiti matters in and of itself, or it doesn't. And, in the context of talking about politics or religion or any of these, or ideology or any of these issues, it's absurd to try to argue that it doesn't. Of course it matters. But many of these people think about politics in a way that begins from the ideal and proceeds downward to the real. And thus, as soon as they encounter a problem that's real, they try to retreat to the ideal to offer what I think can be properly called idealistic excuses. So the question is as follows. I'm going to slightly reword it just for clarity. He opens by saying, this was one of your most interesting and illuminating videos for me. Even though I am no fan of religion myself, I still find your generalizations about Islam unacceptable. Why are they unacceptable? Because, he says, I worked from exceptional and extreme examples such as the history of Mauritania and the history of Saudi Arabia. Okay? Now again, this is just as absurd as if someone said to you, no, the elections in Florida that elected President George W. Bush, those aren't representative of democracy. Of course they're not. They're a tremendously important political event in and of itself. Can we draw conclusions from those elections that are important for other elections in the future? Yes. It doesn't represent anything other than itself. This is about the separation of the real from the ideal, and to plunge into and really engage with what's real in political history in a meaningful and sincere way. Right? The history of Mauritania is one country in Africa, really matters in and of itself. It really does. My line of reasoning begins from something real and concludes with something real. It's really not about ideals in this sense at all. I'm not looking for Mauritania to provide me with an idealized representation of Islam, and I'm not looking for Florida or Haiti to provide me with an idealized representation of democracy. Nor, for example, do I look at the history of the United States or the history of Haiti to provide me with an ideal of revolution. Both of them have very different, very interesting histories of revolution. You can learn a lot from studying the history of the revolution in Haiti, history of the revolution in the United States. Okay? Now, he also says Saudi Arabia somehow doesn't represent Islam. Okay? Now, again, what could that possibly mean? Bring it back to Mexi and Privileged Vegan. What are we talking about? If we're talking about, quote, communism, unquote, but you're excluding from consideration China and Russia from the history book. These are such enormous, influential, fundamental aspects of the history of communism. Now, I mean, also a place like East Germany is tremendously important. How could we possibly exclude from a discussion of Islamic politics, the role of Saudi Arabia, frankly, in any period of the history of Islam. So that's even more absurd. Now, I do think it's fundamentally stupid to dismiss the history of Mauritania as something unimportant. I do think it's stupid to dismiss the history of Haiti as something unimportant. I'm someone who spent a lot of time and energy studying history and politics of Laos, the Laotians in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, and, for example, the Korean Ojibwe. Those are all places, again, I think it would be stupid for someone to have a contemptuous and dismissive attitude towards the political history of those peoples and those countries. But many do. Many do. Why? Because it is possible for them to do so. It is possible for people to dismiss, ignore, and overlook a small and powerless and poverty-stricken country like Laos or Haiti. But it is absolutely impossible to overlook and ignore the political history of Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. So here I have to question the sincerity of the person asking the question, although again it's a very polite, well-worded question, and I will continue. So he asks, how can I possibly treat extreme examples like Mauritania and Saudi Arabia as an accurate or fair representation of the history and reality of Islam? I don't think, if you search in your heart of hearts, I think you will find there is no conflict between the concept of extreme and of reality. The problem you have is the contrast between the extreme and the ideal. The misconduct, corruption, and incompetence that was demonstrated in the state of Florida in the election of George W. Bush, you could say was extreme. It's not typical for an American election. It's not average. It's not normal. It's not universal. And for all of those same reasons, it's all the more important for us to study and for us to learn from. When we deal with things that are real, this is an irrelevant question. Are they extreme, or are they average, or are they typical? At what stage will we say the history of communism in China is average or typical or normal rather than extreme? Of course, it contains extremes. But I'm not looking for those extremes to represent something other than what they actually are. So this is a sense in which the sort of Platonic or Neoplatonic bias in Western education, I think, poisons the engagement with politics. And this is an example of how political philosophy forces us to base our discourse in what's empirically real only, to proceed, as I would say, not just skeptically, but nihilistically, and not to proceed from one ideal to another, or not to treat the ideal as a criterion for the real. If the ideal is moderate, to discard the evidence provided about what's real as failing to live up to that standard, as being accurately representative of what's supposed to be ideal. What you're doing is sifting through the evidence of what's real and only picking and choosing examples that will live up to your ideal. And that is, I think, in the strictest sense, insane.